Welcome. Hi everyone. Hi again. This is Murat Günaydın from Deloitte Turkey, working as a partner in sustainable services. Welcome to today's panel, which is hosted by Chapter Zero Turkey in collaboration with Deloitte. As most of you will know, Chapter Zero Turkey is an organization hosted by TÜSİAD, which aims to support the development of competencies of corporate management and supervisory bodies to meet the local and global needs on climate governance. Chapter Zero Turkey was launched in 2023 as part of Climate Governance Initiative. The core mission of the initiative is to promote the implementation of World Economic Forum's principles of effective climate governance while equipping the executives, non-executive directors, boards with skills and knowledge to make climate change a boardroom priority. If you allow me, I would like to give a brief background about today's agenda. I will just say a few words and then leave you with our valuable guests. COP28 started with high hopes and ended up with success for some parties and with hard feelings for the others. Transitioning from fossil fuels, pledging funds to loss and damage funds, increasing countries' capacities for renewables, decarbonization efforts, ways for keeping the global warming below 1.5 Celsius degrees were among the major topics that were on the table. This was the first COP that officially acknowledged fossil fuels are the root cause of climate change. More than 100 countries agreed to triple renewable energy capacity and double the global rate of energy efficiency by 2030. Financing those efforts was the other side of the coin, and it was a discussion topic during most of the events. But what about businesses? What should they think about the outcomes of the event, and what should the executives, non-executives take to their boardrooms to talk about? Today, we will try to get answers to that with our dear guests. Today, we have Melsa Ararat, Chapter Zero Turkey, Advisory Board Member and CDP Turkey Director. Welcome, Melsa. And Karina Litvak, who is the founding chair of CGI and also working as non-executive director at Terna. Welcome, Karina. Before leaving the floor to our guests, I would like to remind you that you can send us your questions if you have any by typing them in the Q&A box on your Zoom panel. At the end of today's discussion, our guests will try to address them if we have time. Melsa and Karina, the stage is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Murat Bey. Well, how do we start, Karina? Where do we start?
Yes, indeed. Let's just jump in.
Exciting developments. It's the beginning of the end of fossil fuels, as some say. But you were there, so let's hear your impressions first, I would say. But what was the outcome? What do you think were the most important results of COP28?
Sure. I mean, look, depending on your vantage point, you may see this as the glass half empty or the glass half full. I would say that given that we went into this COP with fairly low expectations, they were generously exceeded. The mere fact, as Murat pointed out, that there was an acknowledgement of the role of fossil fuels and an acknowledgement of the need to transition away, that phrase transition away, was frankly pivotal. Was it enough? No, it wasn't enough. Are we on track to meet the 1.5 degree ceiling? No, we are not. So we're still in very deep trouble, but at least we're pointing in the right direction. And that is a very big thing. And for that to have happened in the heart of, oil and gas country, in a part of the world where government revenues are entirely, or not entirely, but heavily dependent on oil and gas revenues, is extremely significant. So I think we need to take some comfort and some encouragement from the fact that the UAE government was successful in persuading everybody to sign on to that commitment to transition away. Now, how it's defined and how it's executed still is punch full of big loopholes, but at least we know that that's where we want to go. So that's I think, a positive. There are lots of negatives which we can run through, but in terms of the implications for all of us as board directors, there are some very real ones that I think we can then start to explore together.
I also think that it mattered because in the beginning, just before the beginning of the conference, UN declared that we have already hit 1.4 degrees. And that was kind of big news, and that would mean that the greenhouse gas emissions being cut by 43% compared to 2019 levels by 2030, if we were to stay within 1.5 degrees of warming above the pre-industrial levels. So I think that was important, the acknowledgement that we are using our budget.
We absolutely are overusing our budget. And the other key takeaway from this COP was a commitment to triple renewable energy. Now, that's all, it sounds good, but why is it so important? Because nobody is going to give up on fossil fuels unless there's a ready alternative already up and running. So, and I noticed, for example, when I was in Turkey last July for the launch of Chapter Zero Turkey, all the talk from the banks who spoke at the launch was about how they were investing in green energy. It's always very, very much easier to invest in positive stuff than to disinvest and shut down and clean up the dirty stuff. No one really wanted to talk about that. And we do have to do it. We have to take those coal-fired power plants out of production. We have to take obsolete industrial capacity out of production and upgrade it and invest in the new. But we won't be able to disengage and wean ourselves from the high carbon emitting industries until we have already built up the substitutes for them. Otherwise, we're going to leave people without energy, without vital commodities. And so that's positive. It can sound a little bit like an easy way out, but it is actually very positive that there is this commitment to tripling renewable energy. And it has very practical implications, again, for all of us in our boardrooms. Why? Because all of us use energy to a greater or lesser extent. And all of us therefore have the opportunity to substitute away from carbon-based energy sources to clean ones. So that's a very real question for boards to bring up tomorrow morning in their next board meeting.
I think the most important outcome is the acknowledgement by the parties that business is a part of the solution. I think it was never that strong in the wording before.
Yeah.
So business is a key party to accomplish the goal of staying under 1.5. And so COP28 was the largest ever gathering of people coming together to work together. And of course, some have criticized the let's say, the dominance of business in the meetings. But what I hear, I wasn't there, but what I hear from my friends and colleagues who were there, that people, the CEOs and the business representatives were all talking in corners, exchanging experiences, discussing technologies, alternative technologies, discussing what worked, what didn't work. So it was a great opportunity for exchange, and the business has definitely put itself in a role of leadership in supporting the transition or enabling the transition away from fuels. So, okay, it's not phasing out the fossil fuels, but it's transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems. And this is the first acknowledgement that the fossil fuels as the cause of climate change. So I think that is very important. The pledges by countries, of course, are important in terms of increasing the renewable energy capacity, and also a controversial pledge to triple nuclear energy capacity by 2050 by 21 countries plus the US. Is important. And I think that's also an acknowledgement that the nuclear energy has become more manageable and perhaps safer. But all these countries would, of course, have to face the public pressure in their own communities, whether that plan can go ahead or not. So what I see is that the nuclear energy will be a very important discussion topic in those countries who have committed to triple the nuclear energy.
I think you're right about
it
that.
is as safe as we think or they think it is, and whether it's manageable. At the end, it has to be the people who are living around those power plants, whether it's acceptable or not. So we will see whether it will be implemented or not.
Mm-hmm.
I think in addition to the negotiated part of the meeting, of course, the non-negotiated part, the coalitions and pledges part, private sector were very, very important. And another one that was remarkable is the decision or the pledges to cleaning up methane leaking systems.
Yes.
By 50 oil and gas companies. Wasn't it a surprise to you? I didn't expect that.
Yeah. So in two respects, it was a surprise. One, it was to me, as some in the audience will know, I spent 9 years on the board of an oil and gas major. I stepped down last May and have since joined the board of a power grid operator. So still in the energy sector, but very different end of the energy value chain. Those who exist in the oil and gas bubble, it's a very, very large, obviously, group of operators. You have a small group of leaders for which that methane pledge was very, very weak, right? These companies are already well ahead of achieving those targets. So when I first saw it, and I saw my former company subscribe to it, I thought, what are you doing? You're well ahead of that. This is embarrassing. On the other hand, the fact that, as you say, it included 50 companies who previously were completely disengaged from these discussions, national oil companies, smaller operators, that's very significant, very significant. So we can do a lot better than what that target sets. I mean, the evidence is that this leading group of oil and gas companies have already embarked on that several years ago. It is possible to be far more ambitious, but at least we've got a big, broad church, as we say, including especially I think the national oil companies is a really big one because they are amongst the largest emitters.
Absolutely. And I understand that the contribution of methane to global warming is 80 times that of carbon, and that is striking. And
Absolutely.
know that carbon stays for thousands of years, whereas the lifetime of methane is about, something like a decade, I think. So that's a very efficient and quick way.
Exactly. It's an efficient and oftentimes cost-efficient way of achieving a significant drop in emissions in the near term. So we can't not do it. And there's a good reason why it's the subject of regulation in many countries, because it is such an obvious win.
Yeah. I live in the Netherlands, and of course, the Dutch government has been focusing on methane reductions. And that creates a challenge because the farming community,
yes,
opposing to it. And so we are facing a lot of protests, roadblockings by the farming community. So this is another area of clashes between government policies and the communities, in addition to nuclear energy. So how are you going to deal with these social issues or economic issues that are more relevant to certain parts of the society? So it is going to be difficult, challenging, but there's no going back from that, I think. The second important outcome for me when I read the pledges or the declarations is the recognition of the link between climate and nature. Don't you think so?
Absolutely. And I was gonna jump on that point when you raised the question of farmers, because of course the agricultural value chain is where nature is so critical. And this was also the first COP where nature was really elevated to being basically the other side of the coin of the climate challenge. We will not achieve our climate goals unless we also address biodiversity and nature, and we will not address our biodiversity goals without addressing climate. They really are completely interdependent. But it's also the case that agriculture is a significant emitter. Oil and gas companies love to point that out. We're not the only bad guys, right? It's also agriculture, that industry that you all love to romanticize is a major contributor to climate change. And it's arguably even more difficult to contain because it is so dispersed. But approaching climate and nature in an integrated way really does enable us to address the challenges that we face today with our agri-food industry. We are fundamentally unsustainable in the way that we produce food. Our heavy reliance on monoculture, on excessive use of pesticides and fertilizers and so forth. So there's a lot of progress been made in identifying ways to reform agriculture that will restore nature and bring down the impact on climate. And we have no choice but to address that. It also goes through something that, again, communities don't like, which is rethinking our diets. Right?
People complaining about how expensive red meat is, and I would say it should be 10 times more expensive.
Exactly.
You want to compensate the damage it does to the climate, and of course, fresh water use and deforestation, forestation. So, well, it's all good. It's, I think, beginning of the end of fossil fuels, but also beginning of a wide recognition of our dependency on nature and our impact on nature. That's I think very important.
Absolutely. If I may add, our host today, Deloitte, has done some very good work on what they refer to as nature capital and the role that nature plays in generating value in our businesses. And therefore, again, this poses some really interesting challenges for those of us in the boardroom who have to think about how we set our objectives around product development, around operational processes. There's so much more that we could be doing to run our businesses in a way that is kind to nature and ultimately moves from taking from nature to restoring. You see more and more companies now who are making so-called nature positive pledges. In other words, leaving nature in a more positive place than where they found it. I've seen this with property development companies that are looking to, when they acquire a piece of land that is degraded, to actually restore the land at the same time as they develop it and put buildings on it. There's really quite a bit that we can do to add value to nature in a way that benefits our businesses. And that really is an area that belongs in the boardroom.
Absolutely. Well, I was also trying to follow what the position of the Turkish government was at
Yes.
28, of course. I mean, Turkey is highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, being in the Mediterranean region. And the extreme weather events have been intensified, have become more frequent during the past decade. And also the freshwater capacity. Turkey actually faces to become water scarce by 2030. Can you believe that? And that raises concerns about social issues and food security. And on the other hand, Turkey is the number 15 largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions with 400 million tons.
Yeah.
And half of it, approximately half of it, comes from coal. And yet, Turkey was the last, I think one before the last, to ratify the Paris Agreement 5 years after signing the agreement, under heavy pressure from business leaders who wanted clarity of the roadmap, who wanted less ambiguous climate strategy, etc., and the NGOs, of course, NGO pressures. So in 2021, Turkey also, after signing ratifying the Paris Agreement, pledged to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2053.
Mm-hmm.
And this has led the way to a leap in climate change policies or climate change action or climate action of Turkish government. And following that, there was an MOU, a memorandum of understanding between the World Bank, IFC, EBRD, France, and Germany, and United Nations to help Turkey, now that the government would prefer that wording, to achieve its target and provide technical assistance and development financing of about $3.2 billion. And in addition to that, for the next 2 years, the World Bank has committed to another $2 billion together with working with UNDP and other agencies. But despite all that, and a very clear direction, although not sufficiently, I guess, concrete, Turkey is committed to renewable energy. It's national, the NDCs are not satisfying the activists or experts because the current targets mean that Turkey will continue to increase its emissions by 30% by 2030. So the target means increasing 30% by 2030. And what's expected is actually reducing by 35%.
Of course.
Reducing by 30% if we were to contribute to staying under 1.5 degrees. Despite all this background, Turkey's presence in COP28 was by commentators considered to be passive-aggressive. So I was reading the views of the experts and scholars who have scrutinized Turkey's position in the meeting. What is most striking is that Turkey refused to sign the pledge for increasing the renewable energy by threefold. And that's not understandable because the current plans is already to increase it to 2.5 times.
Right.
So why did they stay away from that? It's kind of, a question to be asked to the government, why not? So Turkey has stayed away from a lot of the coalitions and declarations and whose objectives were clearly aligned with the Turkey's strategy of climate change and let's say the not so clear but directionally obvious strategies. So it's a mystery why they had stayed away from all those.
It is a mystery, but it's also the case. We've seen this before. We saw this during the 4 years of the Trump administration, that when government is missing in action, business just gets on with it, right? So the fact that the banks have pledged to massively increase their financing of renewable energy, they're not going to build it unless there's demand for it. And the demand needs to come from industry and from municipalities who are supplying energy to households.
Demand is there. I mean, I think that there is this contradiction in how Turkish government acts in different platforms and what the strategy is, what the direction is. For example, Turkey announced its candidacy for hosting COP31. So there's that that announcement made by the president. So that's interesting. And Turkey will also host the 16th UN Biodiversity Conference starting next year, and will chair it for 2 years. Yeah. So there are all these pressures, reputational risks for Turkey, not walking the talk in a way. But when it comes to action, Turkey is very reluctant or cautious to make commitments which are not really in any way enforceable by any mechanisms. So that's interesting. And of course, that brings us to the role of businesses and the importance of the role played by the business organizations. As you know, TÜSİAD, the host organization of Climate Governance Initiative, has been a great, let's say, force of nature, I would say, in lobbying for a more clear pathway to net zero by organizing conferences, writing position papers, urging for the ratification of Paris Agreement before it was ratified, and setting the target for net zero by 2050. And it has participated in a lot of the national commissions, committees, boards. And I think the relation between TÜSİAD is a member of Business Europe, and the government has really improved the quality of Turkish climate action going forward. And we see that during the past, let's say, 10 years. I must also say that some bureaucrats have also played a very significant role as being determined to move the agenda forward.
Good.
Some ambiguities and contradictions in the political sphere. So we should thank to those bureaucrats who pushed the agenda forward, and also TÜSİAD representing the large businesses to a great extent, moving the agenda forward and lobbying for a more ambitious target, bringing together businesses, facilitating exchange of experiences. It played a great role, and I'm sure you experienced or witnessed that in other countries in Europe, that business organizations, the umbrella organizations of businesses, are playing an important role.
Yes, although it's a mixed picture. It's a mixed picture. What you're describing sounds pretty darned impressive. I think what we're seeing, unfortunately, in some countries is a retraction. Because the issue is becoming politicized in a way that is damaging, even though so many large businesses, large and small, have committed significant amounts of capital to the transition and don't want to have the rug pulled out from under them. Right now that they've embarked on this, it's not something that you can switch on and off. Right, when you finally just acknowledge that climate change is vital, or a climate strategy, a climate transition strategy is vital, you can't just dial it down because some politicians are turning it into an ideological, electoral issue. But we are seeing that. We're seeing it in the UK. We're seeing it in the US. We're seeing it in the Netherlands, as you've just witnessed. It's spreading. And it's something that if there isn't a strong business voice, and it's odd, right, that you would have the business lobby and the environmental lobby pulling in the same direction, but that just tells you how desperate the situation is.
Yeah. And that reminds me of a discussion and some criticism against, the businesses lobbying for their own interest. And over the past few decades, I think the nature of business has changed tremendously. I mean, business organizations have turned into social organisms in a way. And one of the most important factors for sustainable growth is attracting talent.
Yep.
And that is where the most important, I guess, contribution to a sustainable growth to the companies come to the fore, that you need to attract talent, and the talent, the young people, smart people, they are aware of the climate change risks, and they have a long future ahead of them. And they don't be associated with, I would say killing. I was reading an article in The Economist the other day, and some of the activists who have taken it to a next level, for example, an engineer not only stopping to use his car, but also destroying his car so that nobody else can use his car.
Oh my gosh.
So, and a nurse trying to do some actions that you might actually label as kind of violent, but he said she's trying to stop people dying because every person contributes to killing of 2 people every year if we continue to consume at this level. So there is an ethical dimension and moral obligation of the business organizations and the CEOs who actually lead those organizations. The power that they have obliges them to be responsible and have the conscience that whatever they do, they will have an impact on the lives of people around them and the communities they have an impact on, and everybody actually, because it's not a local issue, the climate change, all around. So that is very important, the role of the business leaders, the, let's say, moral and ethical obligations of the business leaders to make sure that they do understand their impact on nature and their dependencies on nature as well.
Do you know, it's interesting because within the confines of the boardroom, in my experience, there's often been a reluctance to see the company or the CEO take positions that are perceived as political. Yeah. Even though, as you rightly point out, staff under the age of 40 care about this so much. Young people will not join certain industries anymore unless there's really clear evidence. I mean, I saw this in my oil and gas company. The CEO started a blog and people were just, piling in with comments. And there were comments from the young engineers who were saying, I am so glad that my company is now going to make use of my skills in a way that is going to solve the biggest problems facing humanity and the planet instead of the opposite. That really does fire up people. So you're absolutely right to point out the impact on staff, but it's taking a while to percolate up into boardrooms that this is something we need to worry about and take action on. One, to retain and attract good people, but also to position our businesses in a way that will resonate with the public. And so this concept of the CEO activist or the CEO citizen is a new and uncomfortable one, but it's a really important one. I mean, I think in some countries it's become bound up in some other issues. For example, in the United States around Black Lives Matter and LGBT rights and abortion, it's become, a lot of social issues have grafted themselves onto us in a way that has really made the issue radioactive. But if we just focus on climate change, to my mind, it's really a binary question. Do we as a company and do we want our CEO to position him or herself as a voice for constructive policy? And I think the answer has to be an absolute yes, because without policy that supports risk-taking in our businesses, we're going to really struggle. I mean, we're going to have to make investments in new technologies that are significant. And it's always very tempting to put it off and stick with what we know. It's profitable today. Let's just wait. And a good board is really going to look to the day after tomorrow. And yes, rationally, a lot of times those big investments they're not quite, shall we say, justified financially unless we have certainty that regulatory standards will move to favor what we're investing in, and conversely penalize the dirty old practices of the past and present. We see this in airlines, for example, or, my former company is in the business of manufacturing airline fuel. Investing in sustainable aviation fuel is expensive. It's literally several hundred million euros to convert one petroleum refinery into a biorefinery, just to take one small example. You can't do that unless you're assured that airports are going to buy your sustainable aviation fuel. They're not going to buy it unless regulation makes them, because it's more expensive. And, passengers are not going to pay the extra fares. So all of these things are interconnected. And it means that we have no choice as board directors and as CEOs and leading businesses to use our voice in policymaking in a way that supports our goal to effect a transition. That's an uncomfortable place for us to be as directors. It's new and different.
They need a level playing field that rewards those who look forward further, and those who are focused on short-term and blindsided. In fact, the research shows that those CEOs who are very vocal about those issues, they don't really contribute to the market value of the company. So speaking or being an active voice doesn't really have an impact on companies, how attractive those companies are for investors. But doing the right thing within the organization matters. And I think this really starts with the assessment of the dependencies of companies' operations and throughout the whole value chain on nature.
Yep.
And also the impact on nature, and looking again through all the value chain. And only then, when you understand your dependencies and your impact on nature, then a company can identify the opportunities that are available and the risks that they might be facing in the future. And then they can align their competitive strategy accordingly, because unless you know your dependencies, your risks, and your impact and your opportunities, you can't really incorporate those into your competitive strategy. So it is for businesses an essential step in going forward to make this assessment. And I think the next thing is really to measure and put targets. And I think Task Force on Nature-related Disclosure has put forward a really good methodology for companies to make this assessment. So I think being aware of the tools available for businesses to in a way, streamline their strategy to the new era. The board should be aware of those tools and support available to them to align themselves. So that's very important. The second thing, I think, the traditional or most, let's say, observed way of dealing with sustainability issues by appointing a sustainability officer and a sustainability expert, so-called, is not going to be sufficient. It's a responsibility and the capacity in the boardroom to understand what's going on and to make sense of all these assessments is essential.
Yeah.
Neither the strategy in terms of competitive strategy and then your financing strategy linked to it and etc., they cannot be decoupled from the climate agenda. So, for example, we know that the technological developments is a very important factor limiting from countries and companies to linking the sustainability to their economic systems. So, where to invest? How to invest in what parts of your operation in terms of alternative technologies is a big thing. Some technologies may become obsolete with creative destruction. So, what is going on in your own industry? Keeping up to date with those is very important. So sustainability must be hardwired in the board discussions, I think, not just an additional item in the agenda. What are we doing in sustainability now? Everything that is discussed in the boardroom must be assessed from sustainability angle. And this is going to be, I think, a big thing in moving forward, the increasing capacity in the boardroom of understanding and reacting to sustainability issues.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right about that. There's still a tendency to think of it in terms of what does the report say? Did we get into this or that index? Yeah. You know, what grade did we get, you know, from CDP or anybody else? And just completely skipping over this question that you've just laid out, which is how does it actually fit inside strategic planning and inside audit and inside, you know, the risk management framework and the remuneration strategy and our human capital strategy. There's so many different angles that the board is ordinarily responsible for overseeing, where sustainability and climate in particular play a really, really significant role. And yet too few boards really grasp that. And that's something that, you know, we're all, of course, through Chapter Zero Turkey, working very hard to change.
Yeah. Well, Turkish businesses have been remarkably, let's say, foresighted in that respect. So that is indicated by a very high number of Turkish companies being listed in CDP's A-list of global leaders
Yeah.
in climate change, in water, and also in supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
So this gives me some hope.
Mm-hmm.
Some hope. And also looking into government's strategy, climate change strategy, gradually being, let's say, uplifted with the support from businesses and encouragement from businesses is very important. Of course, TÜSİAD is a member of Business Europe.
Mm-hmm.
It means they have first-hand understanding of the regulatory framework that is evolving and that has evolved, obviously, in Europe, and most of these large businesses have dependency on their trade with European Union. So in that respect, of course, when we think of how to mobilize finance, there is enough finance, there is enough money, but it's not allocated properly. How do we make sure that the money is allocated properly to where it's needed the most? So that's very important. For example, the growth is an important objective for, of course, Turkish economic policy. And for many countries, it has been lagging back since COVID-19. And of course, we may argue whether growth is good or bad. I'm on the argument, I'm on the side that growth is necessary, but the question is not whether we should grow or not, whether the economies should grow or not, but what should be the quality of that growth, and how we can make sure that this growth is not a threat to sustainability. And that really is a very important challenge, I think, for businesses and also for national governments. And they need to work together. And I think Turkey has an opportunity in that area where the private and public partnerships can really help transform, slowly shaping climate policy and climate action to a really effective one. So I'm really hopeful in that respect. Then I would like to also mention probably World Economic Forum's the Future of Growth initiative that also puts forward the dimensions of a growth that is not threatening, that we exceed the boundaries of the planet. So that's also something that the companies and the boards, I think, should be following and being aware of.
Yeah, I think the challenge oftentimes is that, board directors can read the newspapers and
Headlines.
Right. Well, or even like gain an appreciation of these kind of macro challenges.
Yeah.
But then, and they may in very good faith share those concerns and genuinely want to do something positive about it. But what's missing is that bridge between these macro challenges, which seem very abstract, and okay, what do I do tomorrow when I turn up at my board meeting? What do I need to do differently? What questions should I be asking? What is it that we're doing now that needs to be changed? That's not always obvious. And it's really foggy, I think we have to acknowledge. And so there are going to be little signs that are going to help us kind of signpost our way through the fog, right? One of them is the banks. The banks are becoming more and more savvy about the huge multiplier role that they have. We've always known that banks, have a multiplier effect in terms of how they recycle capital, right? But from a climate transition standpoint, they have a massive amplifier role because where they direct capital, whether it's to penalize dirty industries and stimulate the growth of green industries, that's enormous. We as companies are dependent on our banks, on our insurance companies, on our shareholders if we're listed. All of these are sending us signals that can point us in one direction versus another. And some of those signals will be soft and some of them are going to be more aggressive. I know that in my former company, my oil and gas company, we felt very keenly what we described as the headwinds in the capital markets, that our price earnings ratio in the stock market was weighted down by the fact that we were in the oil and gas business. Now, the explosion of the war in Ukraine turned that on its head because, of course, it triggered a huge supply squeeze. But that's an abnormal circumstance, right? And so in kind of a non-war sort of environment, we were involved. We were functioning in an environment where our access to capital was increasingly constrained. And that is the case for many industries that are perceived as carbon intensive or dirty, right? And to the point where, why am I seeing balloons?
No idea.
Okay. I mean, party time. So to the point where we had a division that is involved in electricity generation, and we were in the process of, and the company is in the process of transforming that from thermal, mainly gas, there's no coal, to wind and solar. And then they got the idea of listing it separately, which is it's in the process of doing, because price earnings ratios are much, much more generous in that sector, which means that if you section that off, even though it's still controlled by a dirty old oil company, it has access to capital on much more favorable terms. Now that is a microcosm of what I think all of us are facing from our banks, our insurance companies, and
absolutely
share equity and debt providers. And we need to think in those terms. We need to think about how we make ourselves more appealing to our financial stakeholders so that they reward us, because they're going to punish us if we don't. That punishment is going to get ever greater absent the war.
And what matters in that area is that now the terms ESG is being phased out because it obviously leaves a lot of the sustainability issues from the picture. And of course, the efforts of international sustainability standards boards and the standards issued by EFRAG in Europe, they all matter in terms of for lenders and investors to also meet their own obligations with respect to the considering sustainability factors in their investors. Well, growth cannot be financed by debt, and especially in Turkey, where saving rates are very low. And dependence on external capital is very important for the growth of the economy. I think credible disclosure based on international standards of disclosure and assurance matters. And of course, insurance sector should play a more active role in de-risking the capital and making sure that the investments actually flow into emerging economies and developing economies where they need it the most. But the first step is really to have this disclosure respected, reliable disclosures by companies and supported by the regulations and assurances. And I was quite impressed by reading the news on the 5th of January that the Public Oversight Authority of Turkey actually mandated companies with immediate effect above a certain threshold to report, to issue sustainability reports immediately in line with IFRS's S1 and S2 standards.
That's
and
fantastic.
Also amazing, isn't it?
I don't know if everyone on this call appreciates how pivotal this is,
Absolutely.
but this is such a leap. I mean, the fact that
So
the fact that the ISSB finally came out this year, or last year rather, with its standards was already an immense progress, an immense step forward.
Absolutely.
The fact that governments one by one, the fact that Turkey is one of the first,
and with immediate effect,
you have to do it.
And not only the S1 and S2 standards, but also assurance engagements on greenhouse gas statements, ISAE 3000, 3042, I believe. They are a part of the Turkish regulation now. So I mean, when I look at from the perspective of Turkish boardrooms, I think there is enough tools and there is enough room for those companies to align themselves in a pathway in accordance with those standards, reporting, looking into their operations, investing where it's needed to benefit from alternative technologies, use the talent. The NGO community in Turkey is very active on climate change, attract the best talent, and then attract external investments. I think that is the key for the Turkish boards, that there are opportunities, there are tools available, and there is no reason to complain that, well, we don't have enough regulations, the regulations are not consistent. So there is no basis for making them as an excuse anymore, I think. There is enough to move forward, definitely.
Between what you've just described and the fact that Turkey is such a significant exporter to the EU, and the EU has such, quite pushy extraterritorial coverage of its standards, including through the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is, a fancy euphemism for green tariff, carbon tariff. I don't see how anyone who is export dependent can avoid the impact of this European regulation. So even if Turkey doesn't move as quickly as it might, it's still Turkish companies are affected by what's going on in Europe.
Well, most
I hear this with US companies who really grumble about the fact that if they're going, cruise companies, if they're going to dock in Europe, or if they're companies that export their products to Europe, Europe is really having a significant impact on standards, while the US is just pouring hundreds of billions into the pockets of companies that invest in green technology. So there are different ways of attacking this problem.
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm hopeful. I'm really grateful to TÜSİAD's efforts in that respect, and kind of, being a bridge between what's happening in Europe and linking the Turkish businesses to the European agenda. Because, obviously, the growth for Turkey is not going to come from anywhere else, but it's trade relations with Europe. The one thing that bothers me a lot, maybe as my last comments on that, is that even the most sustainability compatible growth strategies cannot be implemented if global financial crisis, threat of global nuclear war, and toxic political polarization prevail. So I think peace is the most important prerequisite for sustainability. So I think the climate activists should also campaign for the extension of the New START treaty between Russia and the USA that limits intercontinental range nuclear weapons for another 5 years, because it's ending in 2026. And I don't really see enough activism around pushing for the extension of this treaty. I think peace has to be at the top of our climate action agenda and sustainability agenda. So in that respect, I do value a lot the relationship between USA and China prior to the COP28, that they kind of started competing on who is contributing more to climate action. And Murat Bey reappeared to remind us that we are out of time, right, Murat?
Well, we have, I think, 5 minutes left for questions if we want to, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, Karina. Yes, Karina. We have. That was really a fantastic conversation. Thank you very much. That was really valuable for the attendees as well. We have just one question that I would like to just read to you. It's a long question, but maybe I can just take 1-2 minutes for your answers for that. An anonymous attendee just asked the question. I'll try to read it. Coal phase-out process targeted year is directly linked with the supply security and base load management, as both of them require significant financing requirement and transfer of technical know-how, especially in the developing country context. However, neither the financing nor the technology transfer from developed countries are not enough for this transition. Do you believe the developed countries do their part before asking more commitment from the developing countries? Also, how would you assess the supply security risk given the volatility of global geopolitical agenda? For example, why would Indonesia rely on China manufactured solar panels instead of its own coal resources when there is a risk perception on future sanctions due to Taiwan conflict?
Right. Well, a big question. Big question. I think this year during this COP, we first time saw a commitment from developed countries to support the developing countries in their climate action. But the pledges amounting to 700 million US dollars is, I think, 0.2% of the amount needed for those countries to actually protect themselves against the harms of climate change, to which they have not contributed to. I must say, I was also surprised that Turkey claimed to benefit from loss and damage fund as a high middle income country. There are countries that are in a terrible situation, exposed to tremendous risk of complete loss of their land and their country. So this is just the beginning, I think. And I do think that the amount of finance available to developing countries, committed by developed countries, will increase. But I must also add that we see another contribution to financing of those is the philanthropic contributions. So that's what we started to see from private philanthropic foundations to support the transition in developing countries. Of course, development agencies, development banks have been contributing to the climate change or climate transition. For example, EBRD, IFC, and the World Bank in Turkey are a great source of not only technical assistance, but also finance. So I think we will see an increase in the way or in the amounts that the developed countries have committed to support the developing countries. When it comes to the argument about, okay, well, geopolitical risks and risks of hostility between countries and whether we should be protective of our own, let's say, economy, I'm totally against it. I think globalization has to enter into a new era, which is more just, more equitable. There is no way that we can achieve our targets of economic growth, social justice, equity and equality unless globalization continue in a way that is just and acceptable, benefiting everyone. So I'm totally against this. My country, my borders, my contribution to my own economy argument, because the threats that we are facing are not local. And the impact on the nature is not local. So we are in the same little blue planet and we have to work together. And I really think that one of the most dangerous ideological standpoints in going forward is nationalism. So I favor the discussions on limiting nuclear weapons, trying to make sure that peace prevails in all regions, and also globalization should be put back in track in an equitable and just way so that we can move forward with dealing with the challenges that humanity faces in front of us. And we have to rely on young people. Empower them. Empower women, young women especially, and young
Great messages. Thank you.
I would add one thing in
Sure,
relation to the baseload question. It's a question that is not unique to emerging and developing markets. I mean, even in the most industrialized countries, the shift away from thermal energy to renewable energy is throwing up all sorts of challenges related to baseload management. So the investment, I mean, it's a problem that is live everywhere. There are various, projects underway to boost that so as to couple, basically so as to make renewable energy more reliable. And of course, storage is the other answer to it. But a third answer that I'm seeing happen, and I see it close up because my own company, I'm on the board of the Italian power grid operator. Italy, because of its location, is adjacent to so many other countries, including North Africa. And so one very important contributor to stabilizing the supply of renewable energy is to pool supplies through interconnector links. So interconnectors with France, with Austria, with Slovenia, with Greece, but
Yes.
also with Tunisia, with I think there's one, I hope I'm not making this up. I think there may be one with Egypt underway. Please don't kill me if I got it wrong. But there's just a lot happening in terms of engaging, middle and lower income countries in these opportunities to trade electricity in a way that enables both sides to stabilize their supply. Obviously, we know that Africa throughout the continent has huge untapped supplies of solar energy.
Absolutely.
And it's a question of transmitting it, transporting it to places where there's a deep need. And so that is definitely a work in progress, and there's a lot of focus on that. It's not the only answer, but it's one of them.
Yeah, the infrastructure improvement costs for Turkey to transform to renewable energy is estimated to be around $100 billion. 75 to $100 billion. So that is a very key factor in moving forward, the infrastructure, the grid structure. And
do you know what? When I think how many hundreds of billions we spend on oil and gas exploration and development, this is peanuts.
Yeah, true. Just trade-offs.
Yeah.
I now remember that my very first job when I graduated as an engineer was nuclear power plant construction. Well, this was the plants in Turkey. The year was 1977. So I just wanted to mention that, just to also note the importance of the interaction between government policies and also what people want. So I think going forward, I think the democratic processes in terms of how climate change is met, or what strategies are adopted by the governments, is very important. So another important factor in moving forward is democratic institutions, and making sure that the consultation processes and democratic institutions are in place for all countries in going forward. Otherwise, conflicts and polarization may hamper the progress towards a sustainable development.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Melsa and Karina. It was a privilege to host you in this webinar. And dear guests, and thank you as well for being here and being a part of the conversation. I hope that what have been discussed during this 1 hour will be beneficial for you and your companies. And sorry for the questions that we couldn't respond to because of the reason that we ran out of time. I would like to just remind you that you will be able to see the recording of the webinar on Chapter Zero website and Deloitte Turkey YouTube channel soon. And thank you all, and hope to meet you again soon. Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Murat.